Welcome back to my channel. Today's episode is a quick one about identifying ramps on the tail end of mouthpieces and tables. When I mention the tail end, I mean the back end of the table. So don't forget to hit a thumbs up, subscribe, and like, and share afterwards, and we'll go right to it. Back in the old days, I recall seeing a lot of videos from Salem Repairs of their mouthpiece manufacturing. So these videos, you would see a rotating wheel, and what would happen is it would come up on the table, it would cut this way and back this way onto the mouthpiece. So you can actually see on mouthpieces that haven't been affected many times, this technique used by various manufacturers. You can see very light ridges going up the mouthpiece. Some you can see going sideways on the mouthpiece. Other ones you can see rotary ones where they use a rotary wheel again and cut this way. So anytime we get a mouthpiece, I always inspect the way it was cut, because if it was cut going up the mouthpiece, many times what happens is the wheel, the cutting wheel, would create heat. And on rubber mouthpieces, that's a good and bad thing. It makes it a little bit softer, so it's easier to cut. But also near the tail end of the mouthpiece, it would push down the material because it's warmed up now. And when it finished cutting, that material would bounce back up a little bit. That's the ramp you have to look for. Because if you take a razor blade in this case and you check against this, you would see light underneath the blade from the back end going front. And you can see the light when you check it against the light. This is one of the identifiers. Assume is you also have to check the rest of the ramp, but it would be flat, 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 kinked. And that's one of the identifiers of knowing how it was actually cut. And of course, when you start refacing a mouthpiece, you need to take that into account first before doing anything else. Because if you start cutting it, you're going to end up you'll be getting rid of the ramp, but you also be getting rid of the front part of the table, which would affect the facing curve. And you don't want to do that. So you always want to check your mouthpiece ramp in various ways, as I showed in a previous video. Check this way, up and down the entire table to figure out how it was made and whether there's a ramp there at the end or not. Now, one of my other things that I deal with watches. So I have a lot of these eyepieces that I can actually bounce up here and check and look at the ramps and look at the tables in great detail. And I can actually see all the cutting marks. Sometimes you can feel them too. I have a mouthpiece here where just looking at it feels a little bit rough. Use your fingernail and you can feel all these ridges going one way. And with this, I know there was a wheel that ran this way or this way, and it cut this way, cut it that way. So even though that would generate heat, it's not just a single point of a wheel. Say this was a thing, not just a single point of a wheel cutting down the table. You have a wheel cutting like this in more than one minute surface. So it cuts it a little bit better. Of course, creates different methods of heat too. So it cut it there and go down that way. So interesting things different manufacturers did when they created mouthpieces. But it's always good to check and see if you can see how the mouthpiece was made. Let's look at a couple diagrams of what I'm talking about. So my fingers were in the way in the background, but you can't see that. But basically what happened here is you can see the very end to the left. You'll see this gap of light right here, but then my finger's behind it. Sorry about that. And you can see light up here. And what's happening is this is going from here all the way up to here. So it shows some type of angle. And what we have is the ramp is on the back part of the mouthpiece here, is identified there. And I exaggerated a bit here. I added a bit of additional ramp right here at the end. But what happens is if you try to reface a mouthpiece and make the table flat, what's going to happen is you're going to cut down the ramp, and you're going to cut down the front part of the ramp at the beginning of the curve, right here. And what happens is, as you see here, is as you cut it down and make the table flat, because the ramp could create a lot of excessive cutting there, is you cut into the facing curve of the mouthpiece. So you have to be really careful when you first start with a mouthpiece. And there's a very easy solution to that. First of all, start with I'm using a block here because it's just easier, steel block. And you get so I have a flat surface, usually it's a piece of glass. I'm just using this as an example right here. And your sandpaper. And you really only want to use very little. So if this is the edge, I'm just going to go here. You can use your finger and put it here and start rubbing against just the back end of this. Let me put this vertical so it's a little bit easier to see. What I'm basically doing is I hold the mouthpiece and I'm just gonna sand down the back of the table. A little bit at a time, getting it down. There's various ways of doing this, of course. You can use little files just to file down this edge. And as you go along, you just keep checking to get it flat. This part of the mouthpiece is not as critical as this other part. So this part of the mouthpiece table is not as critical as the rest of it. So if you take a little bit too much material off, I really wouldn't worry. Just be careful when you do go to work on the entire table that you don't push the back end of the mouthpiece into the sanding material. So always take a look at the ramps there. So as I mentioned, the first thing you want to do when you get a mouthpiece in is always check the table and see if there's a ramp on the end of the table or not, because you want to take care of that first, and just that. As I showed there, you just want to rub that off just in the back part using either files or sandpaper. Many times it may be easier just to go left to right versus up and down, as long as in the end you kind of make it look and fit in with the rest of the cutting that you do. So that's what this episode is about, is simply identifying one potential problem when we're refacing a mouthpiece, looking at the ramp. And that's usually the first thing I deal with any of the old vintage mouthpieces. So I hope this episode was informational for you, and thanks for listening. Any questions or comments, put them down below. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, like, subscribe, and share. You gotta love the knowledge, gotta love life, gotta love mouthpieces. We'll see you next time.